Howdy, folks. So obviously today we are not meeting because there was a power outage. And so I'm recording this lecture on Justinian's foreign affairs. And I'm also going to record one that'll be probably shorter on his internal affairs. And this is a win-win the way that this worked out because I'm so behind in my classes that I didn't want to shortchange our discussions, but also when I record lectures, I can go through the material much faster. So this is stuff, obviously, that's really important. We know from already having read the Treadgold book on Justinian, this is a landmark period in Byzantine history. And so when we talk about Justinian, this is more like the age of Justinian. And there's three topics, as you can see from the syllabus. The first one is this one, and it's going to deal with Justinian's foreign affairs. Overall, my thesis is I'm pretty critical of Justinian. Other historians haven't been. The next one is going to be just about how he was governing and the problems he faced in his empire. And the last is on art, culture, and trade. So the thing is about this overall period, what we should see it as is a kind of last phase of Rome and first phase of Byzantium in some senses. And we can see this with the character of Justinian. So I'm going to share the screen and talk about this now as a PowerPoint slide. Okay. So here we go. You can see this map here, and you notice the pink areas. These are the lands under the empire's control under Justinian the Great. He has this really long reign, decades and decades. And under him, the empire regained much of the former Roman Empire's greatest expanses. Not completely. You can see Gaul's not taken over, Britain, obviously, and only parts of Spain. But nonetheless, this is the largest area of land occupied by the Byzantines since Constantine, like since the big collapse of the Western Empire in the late 400s. So we have like this 50-year period between the fall of the West, and then we've got Justinian. He gets all this land, but his lands are only obtained ephemerally. He loses them after his death. Most of them are lost very, very soon after. And after his reign, and this kind of epic period of Byzantium that I'm clumping under Justinian's reign, the empire of Byzantium would more face the north and the east and not look to the west and to the south anymore. And so it's a very big change. It's this era that happens right before the Muslim invasions, which we're going to cover before the midterm. And that's a pretty big deal because it sets us up for why the Muslim invasions were able to happen so successfully in many, many cases. So I want to begin with talking about who Justinian was. You can see his reign here, and you know from Treadgold, he ruled for a very long time. The last Roman emperor, you could ask this question, was he? And in some ways, he was very much a westward facing ruler compared to other earlier Byzantine rulers that had ruled out of Constantinople. As you know from Treadgold, Justinian was Latin speaking. He was from Illyricum. He had these ambitions of turning the Byzantine Empire into, resurrecting the former Roman Empire. The way he codified his laws, he did it in Latin. So there's a lot of ways that Justinian was similar to other earlier Roman emperors. But on the other hand, he like his the guy that we'd studied, Julian the Apostate, who ruled in the middle of the 300s. Justinian the Great was in some ways not cued into the times. He didn't realize that what his real weaknesses were. And in his grab to get these lands for the West, he really crippled the economy of the Byzantine Empire. So that's what I'm really starting with here. And I want to go through his wars, his religious turmoil, and then just talking about also the problems that he had within his own empire. So anyway, that's what I'm talking about. Um, I'm beginning with religion. A reminder, of course, is that you can't separate religion and put it in a compartment and pretend it's this not important thing. Justinian started out as a very conciliatory figure in terms of his religious affairs, trying to broach the problems with the papacy in Rome and the archbishopric and him in Constantinople. He did this by immediately when his father was ruling, helping him to heal the Occasion Schism. So this is a pretty big deal. The Occasion Schism we learned about last time had separated for the first time the Church of Rome from the Eastern Church, which eventually, of course, becomes the Orthodox Church. And Justinian attempted to change this. He had a conciliatory attitude. So, for example, he even agreed to depose his own archbishop, the patriarch Anthimus, in 536, who was a Monophysite, in order to appease Rome and get back, repair the Occasion Schism. So that's an important thing. When the Pope from Rome, John, came into he entered the city of Constantinople in 526, and Justinian welcomed him and had a very huge kind of diplomatic acknowledgement of the Pope's authority. The thing is that what he was trying to do with this religion and trying to make it conciliatory was set up conditions that would allow him to successfully invade Italy. So he had a motive behind being a consensus builder. And we can see this because he changed his tune as soon as he attacked Italy. And we're going to talk about the invasions of Italy in a moment. But he invaded Italy and immediately, almost after, sent his general Belisarius to depose the Pope, Silverius. So he actually took a pope out of office outright and put in his own guy. His man was Vigilius. This is a kind of funny thing, though, because he put his own man in. He had actually paid Vigilius in exchange for loyalty. But then Vigilius was not cooperative with Justinian. So Justinian thought he was like, okay, now I got my own puppet in who'll do whatever I want. And that didn't actually happen. So I have some examples, and I do want you to know them because they are important for talking about relations between the East and the West in terms of the religious turmoil. And so, for example, this isn't so good. Justinian kidnapped the Pope. He kidnapped Vigilius in 545 because Vigilius was not kowtowing to Justinian's policies on the Monophysites. Justinian was always worried about, like, okay, the Monophysites, they're going to separate. They're big in Egypt and they're big in Syria, and he needed those territories. And so when Vigilius wouldn't go along with him, he just straight up kidnapped him. He put him in house arrest for the rest of his life in Constantinople. But even then, Vigilius wouldn't always go along with Justinian, despite the fact that he was in house arrest. A very big moment here is a ecumenical council of 553. So it's this fifth ecumenical council of Constantinople. And the thing is, with the ecumenical councils, as I'll remind you, it really did. Oops, I'm going to pause here. Hold on. Sorry. Oops. Okay. Now I'm resuming the share. I'm sorry that was an accident, folks. Okay. So sorry about that. There were little problems, as happens. Back to Vigilius and the kidnapped pope. So there, as we remember, the ecumenical councils, all by nature of the fact that they get called ecumenical, define orthodoxy, which we'll remember is this, at least at this point in history, it's mostly interested in Jesus Christ and his nature and where he is in relationship to the Trinity. Orthodoxy is consistently that Jesus is one person, two natures, fully God, fully man. And at this fifth ecumenical council, Justinian was deeply worried about the Monophysites. So, what he did at this council was not change orthodoxy, but rather he condemned three Nestorian writers. These are called the three chapters. It's the three chapter controversy. And you're like, well, who cares? There were three Nestorian writers. Why does anybody care? It turns out that Pope Vigilius cared. And the reason is that these three chapters' writings, even though they were Nestorian, had been used to define orthodoxy in the Council of Chalcedon in 451. So, because Justinian was condemning them, it was like challenge for Vigilius, it challenged what orthodoxy was because their testimony had been used to establish it. So Vigilius wouldn't go along with it, and there was another prolonged split that lasted between that really divided Rome from Constantinople until Pope Gregory, and it was settled in 60, during his term as papacy. Gregory died in 604. Finally, Gregory was like, okay, we can condemn the three chapters just so long as we all agree that the definition of orthodoxy doesn't change. So the thing is that this has important consequences, and I want to see, it doesn't have an outline on this, but this is the takeaway that about all this religious turmoil section that I want to talk about. What happens as a result of the three chapters is that the papacy is much more westward looking. It's isolated in the second half of the 6th century when it's dealing, the papacy is dealing with invasions. There's a group of people called the Lombards that invade Italy. Also, there's kind of like politically isolation in general because Justinian's troops are causing a lot of havoc. And so the Pope couldn't rely on the East for military support anymore, and therefore began to increasingly take autonomous control over religious affairs in the West. So that's a pretty big deal. That's the religious situation. And what we see as a takeover is even though he starts off consensus building, he ends up having a big quagmire. And at the end of his reign, Justinian's religious situation has caused division between East and West. Now I want to get to these Western conquests and losses. So there's two sections on military affairs I need to cover here. And the big picture in this section on the Western conquests and losses, and this is not just my interpretation, but many people's interpretations. Justinian wanted the grandeur of old, but he spent too much money on these Western wars. And he was not paying attention to his real political challengers, the Persians, and as we'll see, other parties. So this ended up weakening Justinian's whole empire incredibly. I like this book, The Art of War. It's one of my favorite books, and it begins, no nation ever benefited from prolonged warfare, and boy, can we see this in Justinian's reign, because North Africa is very short, Spain's very short, but what he did in Italy was crippling to the Roman Empire. So, from Tread Gold that Belisarius is his major general throughout the whole period. And at times, although Justinian recalled him from the Western Front to do different things, and then he'd change his mind and put him in the East, nevertheless, Belisarius was in general a very successful political leader. So he had a challenging situation, but in North Africa, it was only 2 years, and in general, it was taken for Byzantium. This was the most successful of Justinian's foreign affairs, in my opinion, but not just my opinion, because North Africa was very wealthy. Carthage, you might have heard of the adage after the Third Punic War that the Romans salted it, and so it could never come, the earth, so that nothing could grow and it could never come back to power. Not quite. The land in that area around Carthage and the city of Carthage was quite important. And so to get that again actually was a very helpful thing, especially considering that it was a quick one. So that's the exception, though, because Italy was by far the biggest disaster, 20 years. And as you can see from my outline, almost all those lands were gone within, a decade and a half after Justinian had taken them over. So, what Justinian was trying to do was to invade lands that a Germanic barbarian group of people known as the Ostrogoths had taken. And so the Ostrogoths had invaded and they were in power in the 6th century. And these wars, Italy turns out to be, it was very difficult to take Italy. So the resources needed were increasingly a problem. And Justinian tried to solve this problem by issuing something called the Pragmatic Sanction, which, as you can see from the outline, 554, and that's a little later than the conquest. So it's right after the conquests were successful. And what he said was, anybody that's on his team that was the Italians that were in favor of the Byzantine state could just they automatically got the lands that the Ostrogoths had held. So you'd think that that would have worked because that would have sort of were given back some kind of financial incentive for the Italians to take land in favor, and because they could get it from the Ostrogoths that had lost. But the warfare in that 20 years was so damaging, and the taxes raised were so egregious, and the chaos so full, that the Pragmatic Sanction really didn't do anything to help. So I didn't have you read on the wars by Procopius, but it recounts a lot of this damage. One of the things that I do need to add to this section on the conquest of Italy is this point about the city of Ravenna. So you remember from your maps, but I'll show you here. Ravenna is, I'll take my cursor to it. It's up here. And Ravenna had been a major city in times in the 5th century, even supplanting Rome, the capital of Rome, when Rome had been sacked. And Byzantium did manage to keep Ravenna even when it lost most of its other territories in Italy. And this turns out to be super important. We're going to be learning about the ways that the Byzantine enclave in Ravenna, and you can see to the north of that, Venice, that area continued to have more contacts with Byzantium than other areas in the Western Roman Empire. And you can see from this outline that that is held until 751. However, the Lombards were a Germanic population that conquered a lot of Italy after Justinian had temporarily taken over most of the peninsula. So Italy's ravaged. It's got lands that sort of under the Pope. The Ostrogoths had it. Now the Lombards have a lot of it. Byzantium still has it in Ravenna. And all of this fighting, as usual in history, you can see in many, many instances, prolonged warfare, it softened the ground so that when there was another potential invasion, it happened really fast. And that's why the Lombards were so successful. Spain is another situation where Justinian in general failed. So although the Byzantine navy did conquer the Iberian Peninsula by 550, or the south, it was actually just a part of it in the south. There was a Germanic group of people called the Visigoths, and they didn't like it, and they put up a big resistance. And so it was, again, kind of constant warfare that eroded a lot of power in that area. So most of the lands were gone by 624. So it's like Justinian's reign is this light bulb burning very brightly, like a dying star, you could almost say, where it seems to grow really, really big. But if you read what was on the ground in terms of his political expenditures, you could tell that it wasn't going to be that hard for the Muslim invasions to really change affairs. I do want to say before ending this section and on the Western affairs is that there is this really important institutional change, and it's this office called the Exarch. This office, although what we're going to be learning about is how the Muslim invasions took over a great part of the former Roman/Byzantine Empire. But this office of the Exarch that was created in Carthage ends up being a model for later Byzantine ways of handling affairs when times are tough after the Muslim invasions. So the Exarch was an officer that took power in both Carthage and Ravenna under Justinian. And and you know what? I lied. It's not under Justinian. It's under his later successor, the Emperor Maurice, who was very capable and ruled for a long time right before the Muslim invasions. And the Emperor Maurice decided to make this office so that the exarch would be in charge of civic and military affairs. Diocletian had tried to divorce those two in local government because he didn't want the military to have, be autonomously under, its own control. You'll remember that Diocletian helped to solve the 3rd century crisis. But when times are tough and you don't have a lot of resources, having the exarch to be able to control everything, sort of like the style of a Confucian governor in ancient China, that was something that turned out to be more expedient. So this is a sign of things to come, and I just wanted to say that. So my cat, he's on me. I could trap him, but I'm not going to. Okay, moving on. I want to finish this lecture by talking about affairs in the East, because these are the problems that Justinian was ignoring. And because he wanted so badly to retake care of the West, he really mismanaged affairs in the East and laid the groundwork for a lot of problems. So in the West, he's spending tons of money and so much time trying to get these lands. But the Persian state had resurrected recently in his reign, and it had a long legacy, even though the Persian governments in the whole area in the East had waxed and waned over time. They had a legacy of organized military warfare and training that proved to be very challenging for Justinian. So I want to talk about what he tried to do. First of all, I mentioned that with his religious affairs, he was consensus building when he wanted something. He tried to do the same thing with Persia. So he established this endless peace with the ruler of Persia in 532. This endless peace was just to get the Persians off his back so that he could go conquer the West. And what it agreed to was to pay Persia a huge annual tribute. So pay them, and then Persia would just leave them alone. Procopius wrote about in The Secret History how that just completely failed in a lot of ways with other groups of people he paid off, because those people are like, hey, great, they're going to pay us for not invading. All we have to do is invade or threaten to invade, and then they'll pay us more. So, first of all, Justinian lost a ton of wealth. However, it's not surprising that the endless peace was broken. And I'm going to say this name wrong, so I apologize. My ancient Persian stinks, but this was a person mentioned in The Secret History, Khosroes, King Khosroes Nushirvan. And Dr. Ulrich, I'm sure, has a better pronunciation than I do on that. So King Khosroes, he used a plea from the Italian Ostrogoths to go and invade Byzantium. So the Ostrogoths were getting invaded, and they're like, help, help, Persia. And Persia's like, oh, you bad, sad little Ostrogoth kingdom. Boy, you bad, bad Byzantines. We're going to help punish. Boy, we can see this so much in history, where one nation uses the excuse of another, like kind of anybody, puppet person that comes over and says, we need help, to kind of make a play for the kind of moral rectitude and saying, okay, now we can invade. So it was a flimsy excuse, but he did. And he even sacked the city of Antioch, which is really close to Constantinople, obviously. After this, Justinian had to call Belisarius over to the Eastern Front just so that the Persians wouldn't sack all of Constantinople, Byzantium. And so finally, he did succeed in holding the Persians off. But and the main thing that I want to point out here is the importance of the Black Sea. The Crimea is really important for Byzantine trade, and that was still held after Justinian's reign. Justinian's successor, Justin II, decided to refuse to pay the tribute. So Justinian ended King Khosroes' invasions. Part of it was by giving more money, And Justin II said, nope, I'm not going to do that. So the Persians attacked. They took the city of Daras, which is, pretty far to the west, towards Byzantium or Constantinople. Justin II was so horrified that he actually went insane, and his wife ended up brokering a peace. His wife just negotiated that. So finally, that part of the affairs of the East with Persia and Constantinople and Byzantium with the West really ended when Maurice took over. So Maurice was a very capable ruler, and he used a lot of internal strife that was happening in the Persian Empire to regain territories and end the Persian War at that time. So costs a lot of money. That's where the real enemies are. And Justinian's not paying attention to them. Well, this is a really important second kind of invasion that Justinian wasn't paying attention to. And this is a Slavic population. So the Slavic population in the Balkan Peninsula started to invade the Balkan Peninsula in the early 6th century. It takes about 100 years. But, by the early 600s, what we're seeing is just very weak or absent lands that Justinian had taken in the West, and then they're gone. And then we see tons of money paid out to the Persians. And now we see the Balkans taken over by the Slavic population. So the problem, and boy, did I spell that wrong in the PowerPoint. Sorry about that, Balkan Peninsula. I apologize. But the thing that I really need to pay attention to here is that when the Balkan Peninsula is settled by the Slavs, these enemies of Byzantium, it breaks the land bridge between East and West, so that it really was not as easy for people in Western Europe to travel to the East anymore, and vice versa. So what that ends up doing is slowing down contacts and further separating East and West. It's a kind of theme I've been hammering out as we've been talking in this class. Why are the East and the West separating? And so here's a big deal. I said the limes taricus. All that just means limes is boundary. It's like this Slavic boundary, and it's a historian's term. So I want to quote here, and is this the end of it? Yeah. I want to quote this situation. This is what was going on in the Balkan Peninsula in the 7th century. And this is a bishop named John, and I'm going to quote what his description of the situation was. It is recounted that the kings of this epoch had, by means of the barbarians and the foreign nations and the Illyrians, devastated Christian cities and carried off their inhabitants captive, and that no city escaped save Thessalonica only, for its walls were strong, and through the help of God, the nations were unable to get possession of it. But it's still obviously a really big problem. So I'm going to end there, and I'm going to post this. I want to show you. So we're going to be talking about art and trade a little bit. And so some of these slides will come into hopefully class on Tuesday. I am flipping forward just to show you a couple that are important for these most famous depictions of Justinian. And then here is his wife, Theodora. These are mosaics in the city of in the church of San Vitale in Ravenna. So I've seen them. They're beautiful. The color just has maintained over the centuries. And it's a pretty big deal. Look, it's made in their lifetimes. And the emperor and the empress have halos, Caesaropapism at work. And you can see that to the right and to the left are the state and the church. So we have the bishop. There's Bishop Maximianus. And then over on Justinian's other side are the general Belisarius. So there's another general, Narses, in there too. And then Theodora has women off to one of her sides, but she is holding the cup, the chalice with Christ's blood. That's important in the ceremony of the Mass. And then you can see Justinian, he's holding the bread. So these are pretty big deal symbols. And then you can notice also the shield. So look at the sign on that shield. That's that Chi Rho, and that comes from Constantine's vision. So that symbol of the first two letters of Christ in Greek. So just showing how significant all of this authority claiming to be both leader of church and state was. Alrighty, I'm going to stop this lecture now and go on to the next one. So